Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Welcome back, everybody. You may have heard this term before, music heals. Music heals. Been connected to some charity events, concert, things like that. I always heard those two words and I thought, yeah, okay, I guess it can heal. But witnessed it firsthand when I met this gentleman and the people that he's aligned with. Music and the arts definitely heals many. And specifically, I've learned through him, heals people with physical challenges, mental challenges, those who are incarcerated, and so much more. It starts with an organization in the greater New York area called Baltic Street Into Action. He is the president of that, and he's back with us. Peter Jampel joins us here on the program. Hey, Peter, how are you?
Steve, I'm great, and it's so good to be back here with you.
And we're never alone. We have a guest who's joining us.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Connie Tomeno. Connie and I are colleagues who go back many years. Connie is an expert on music and neurological function and is the executive director and co-founder of the Institute for Music and Neurological Function, and is a faculty member at Lehman College. And we're going to launch into really music and how the brain works and responds to music. And Connie's work is fascinating and powerful. So, Connie, nice to have you here.
Welcome.
My pleasure to join you guys.
It's great to have you here. Can we go into that research? Because I'm fascinated by it. I wish I took more courses in psychology back in the day, but how music connects with the brain. Can you give us that as a starting point?
Sure. That's a big starting point because it's only in the past 20 years or so that scientists have really started to unlock how and why music affects the brain the way it does. I've been a clinician in music therapy for 45 years already. And when I started, there was very little known about music and the brain. And so a lot of the clinical things I was observing really didn't have a foundation in scientific evidence. Now we know that the music is processed throughout the brain, and it's the components of music, rhythm, frequency, vibration, tone, harmony, emotional associations with music, they all need to work together for us to have an experience of music. And so it's a very fascinating, very challenging area of science to delve into and to understand.
The musical connection to our past, the memories and things like that, that one's easy to understand. You know, maybe a song takes you back to your childhood. Maybe a song just makes you feel better. Maybe you don't want, maybe you want to feel sad. There's a place for that. There is at some point. But the memory association is there. All the other things with the tonal value, the beat, the harmonies, and all of that. Is there any specific research you can share of how that actually works within our minds?
Sure, I can give you a good example of how rhythm specifically affects neurologic function, how it's processed. And so probably the easy example for everybody to understand is how we automatically tap our feet or move to music. It's something we do unconsciously. It just sort of happens spontaneously. And that happens because of the way the auditory system stimulates through those beats, those frequencies or segments of beats actually stimulate the motor strip in the brain. So we have a way through the auditory system of immediately having a motor response. Clinically, that translates into enabling somebody who has a motor problem like Parkinson's disease, or maybe somebody recovering from a stroke, or maybe a child who's just learning how to walk. It gives us a tool through the use of rhythm in a very specific way to help organize motor function, to either help develop those skills in a very young child, or to help in the recovery of skills in a person who just had a stroke, or to help somebody with Parkinson's disease maintain their independence for as long as possible.
If looking at this at a broad level, if we were to take music and strip the vocals out, the lyrics, strip the lyrics out, in terms of a percentage of how music could still be impactful to help others, be it 50%, 70%, where do you think it would be if we just took the lyrics out?
Wow. Um, Actually, it's probably 90%. Um,
Hmm.
lyrics have a very specific role.
Yeah.
It's a form of communication. It's a way of connecting. It's a way of sharing feelings. It's a way of us um, being affected in a very emotional way to the meanings of those lyrics, right? But the components of the music, the harmonies, the melodic line, we can listen to a non-vocal piece of music and be amazingly emotionally affected by that.
Sure.
So all of those elements are inherent in the music itself. When words are added, it just expands the impact of that music.
I love listening to world music. I could listen to music from other countries. I don't even know what they're saying. and and the voice, the vocals become part of the song. And I'll listen to a lot of songs where I don't even know what they're saying. I can't hear what they're saying because I'm focused on the beat anyway. But it just rides along on top of the beat and kind of enhances it, I find many times.
Yeah. It's interesting because it has been research done where Western music was presented to people who had no experience to that music. So, a culture that's really removed from the Western world. And yet they will respond to certain melodic lines as being sad or happy. They'll indicate that that's what they think they mean
Mm,
purely on the way the rhythm is. If rhythm is very slow, it tends to give us a sense of sadness or lethargy. If it's upbeat, very upbeat, we feel joyful and energetic. So these are inherent in all cultures, and it has a lot to do with our physiological states and how we mentally feel too, and that gets translated into musical compositions because it's inherent in the musicality of our humanness.
this whole music therapy thing, you said, 20 years, we're only just jumping into this now. I'm blown away. It's only been, 20 years. Um, Music therapy in general, the history of it, how far does it go back?
Sure. Well, the profession of music therapy in the United States goes back to the 1950s. Music and healing and health goes back, centuries, from the beginning of time.
Hmm.
Anybody who's worked in healing has used sound in some way. So it's when I say 20 years, it's only the past 20 years that the field of neuroscience, which is relatively new in that context too, has been able to look at the brain and the auditory system in tandem and provide some understanding. But music and healing's been around for a while. The complexities and levels of understanding that music therapists provide is something that's been developing in the United States since the 1950s, for sure.
Yeah. As Connie said, there are really significant studies that look at how music has been a organizing factor in human development from a cultural and neurological point of view, and that music was and is an essential part of how societies organize and how individuals are able, in a way, to find their place in relationship to other community structures. Connie, I want to take you back for a second to the very early days of your work at Beth Abraham Hospital and your association with Dr. Oliver Sacks, world famous neurologist whose work, was transformative in terms of understanding how memory is often under recognized and appreciated in terms of how frozen memory and inaccessible memory manifests itself, and how it can be accessed, and how music played a huge role in his appreciation of alternative strategies. Could you take us back to some of the early days with Dr. Sachs? What your impressions of him were, and how music therapy evolved at Beth Abraham?
Sure. Well, my first experience, and I talk about this all the time because you talk about your um, epiphanies in developing models and things like that. In 1978, I was doing my internship at a nursing home in Brooklyn, um, and was asked to play music on the dementia ward. The dementia wards back then were very isolated. People didn't visit them. People who they didn't even know what Alzheimer's disease was back then. Severe dementia was deemed as being something that couldn't be treated, that people who had this severe level of memory loss had no recollection of who they were, where they were. Nurses told me all they did was feed and water them. I was asked to play music, and the staff um, thought it was unusual, and they couldn't imagine anything would happen. So they said, play the music for them, for the staff. I started to sing a song that I thought would be meaningful to the people in that room. It was Let Me Call You Sweetheart. Um, the residents in that room were incredibly agitated. Half of them agitated, the other ones were catatonic, non-responsive. As soon as I started singing, though, and sang repeatedly for a few minutes, the people who were catatonic woke up. The people who were agitated stopped their agitation, and half of them started singing the words to this song. The staff was amazed and dumbfounded, couldn't imagine what happened. In that moment, I realized that these people were still there. There was a way to connect with them. And there was something about a familiar song that gave me access to the individuals. 2 years later, I had the good fortune of becoming the music therapist at Beth Abraham Hospital, where awakenings took place that Dr. Sachs Oliver had written about. There was a popular film with Bob De Niro and Robin Williams about those patients that we worked with. Oliver had his transformative experience watching these immobile people move to music when the woman who was called the music therapist, a pianist who was there, was able to excite them and re-music them back into action, even before dopamine was available to them. So here was this amazing doctor who was sort of shy and reclusive, but who believed and experienced that music had an amazing impact. When he heard that I was hired, he immediately wrote to me and said, let's meet, welcome. And I asked him about music and memory because I had just had this transformative experience myself with people with end stages of Alzheimer's disease. And he wasn't really aware of the music and memory piece of it. And so together for the next, literally next 35 years, we worked together. But during those early years, he would ask me questions about my patients. How did they respond to music? Could they tap to what these were people with severe neurologic impairment? Could they tap to a beat? Because that gave him some understanding about whether the frontal cortex was damaged, because that's where the perception of timing would be established. We were able, through those little assessments, distinguish between somebody who had a head trauma or stroke with somebody who had Parkinson's disease, because they responded to rhythms in different ways. We started to look specifically at music and memory because I had the good fortune of being a full-time music therapist, which gave me daily contact with individuals using music every day in a very, very specific way to engage them. And over time, these people started to improve. And in fact, I told Peter this story the other day. I was doing a session on one of the units, and there was this woman who had been nonverbal for a while, and she started talking. And the doctors, besides Dr. Sachs, were absolutely amazed. It's how could this be possible? How could she talk? How could she even remember something because her memory is so damaged? And so over the next few years, Oliver, Dr. Sachs, and I um, tried to see if we could recruit some neuroscientists to help us study music and the brain. Because back then it was assumed that if somebody had brain damage, they didn't repair. Their brain couldn't be repaired. The idea of neuroplasticity wasn't even thought about. What people thought, other doctors thought, was that we just saw like little snippets of ability, but it had no capacity for being extended or to be carried over after those sessions. The idea of healing the brain wasn't even thought about, that these were just fragments of ability that were being aroused. But yet, we did see consistent improvement. So in the 1980s, we met some neuroscientists. They said music was too complex to study. They were just at the beginnings of understanding auditory perception of beats and clicks, not even music. But by 1994, the administration, and because of Oliver's fame at that point, realized that this was something they wanted to support. And so the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function, which I had, was formed to be a bridge between the emerging field of neuroscience and the clinical world of music therapy. So there would be ways of having dialogues across these disciplines and advance not only the possibility of research into music and the brain, but also to provide some understandings of how to use music in a very therapeutic way, very targeted way, to help people who were recovering or dealing with different kinds of neurologic impairments.
Connie, could you explain neuroplasticity a little bit more? What actually occurs in terms of alternative neural pathways and
Sure.
how that is a form of healing the brain?
Sure. Well, the whole idea of neuroplasticity means that the brain is always changing. Anytime we learn something new, there's a new pathway a new connection that's been formed that becomes sort of hardwired at that moment. And all of us can think about those moments where something clicks and we remember it and we can do it without thinking too much about it. Any musician knows those days when, after practicing scales for a while, they don't have to think about where their fingers are anymore. So those maps of how to do something become very well formed. When somebody has brain damage, whether it's a child who has some delays in neural development or a person who's had a stroke, obviously there's pathways that have been damaged, or in the child they haven't been formed yet. What we know is that as skills become available to a person, those skills are only available because these networks have been formed. And it could be, in motor function, it could be that more enhanced neurons, connections with neurons between the motor pathways and the associative areas of the brain, or the executive function, which is all planning of how to do something, are better connected. And so those abilities become instantaneous because now there's multiple pathways engaged in allowing us to do something without thinking about it. For a child, there's a great example of children who have language delays. Those usually happen because the pathway, the neural mechanism that connects the patterning of spoken word rhythm is not yet developed. And so the child, it's just recently been found that children with language delays actually have poor rhythm perception. So one of the techniques we can use in music therapy is to allow that child to learn patterns of sound, teach them to recognize patterns of sound. And once they master that, the brain now has connections between timing mechanisms and spoken word that then carries over to their ability to comprehend the spoken word. And so neuroplasticity is all about new connections, enriched connections that allow us to attain and achieve different levels of function that are readily available to us. And that happens until the day we die. When I took biology in high school and college, we were told that by the time we have all the brain cells we need, and by the time we're 20 or so, we start losing them. And it gets worse and worse as we get older. Now we know that's not true. That the brain is constantly growing, connections. And in some cases, it's actually been shown that in the hippocampus, there are new cells that actually do get developed. And some theories about precursors to Alzheimer's disease may be in the mechanism of those cells not really fully developing that causes some of the issues in memory loss. But it's nice to know that we always have the potential to grow and change even so our very last day.
It's funny. I have like a running joke with my best friend, and we always say, "Well, when in our 20s, we probably lost a lot of brain cells from all the crazy partying and everything." So now I can correct that.
Yes, you can feel good about it.
So Connie, with the neuroplasticity, I get a visual of, remember the old school telephone operator, going to date myself, Lily Tomlin. Remember One Ringy Dingy, where, she has the cable and she plugs it in to connect the call, then the other one, then another one. It almost reminds me of that.
Yeah.
Is what's going on here in terms of the connection. And then when a connection is not made, maybe a bad wire or whatever, we're not making a full connection.
Yeah, no, that's it exactly. I mean, it's obviously incredibly complex, but it's along those same lines where, in fact, there's been brain studies of children who were born with hydroencephalitis. So, water on the brain, with certain parts of their brain maybe haven't been developed as well, but yet those children seem to develop normally. And what they find is that areas of the brain that have been damaged actually develop networks in other areas. So, for example, a language in the normal brain where language may be perceived, and I'm thinking more now about, somebody who maybe is born blind, the visual cortex, the occipital lobe, wouldn't be used for vision because that person doesn't have the potential for vision, but yet that part of the brain may develop other auditory capacity because those networks now can be engaged. And that's so why people who have visual impairment have incredible auditory perceptual abilities, because they have enriched networks engaged in listening.
Wow, that's fascinating. That reminds me right away. I'm getting a picture of Stevie Wonder.
Yep.
And Bocelli, just amazing musicians, singers. And I always wondered, even somebody like, I love him, Stevie Wonder, how, that without vision, he was able, and still is, to put music together and come up with all of that. But, it seems reasonable that, that the vision part of his brain is making up for it in an auditory sense. Peter, we have just about a minute or so left. What do you want to add to today?
Well, it's so incredibly rich, the work. We could get into musical entrainment and the way in which people with Parkinson's disease have been able to increase their control of involuntary movements through music. I mean, there's the research that's going on at Connie's Institute with dementia and caregivers, and the capacity not only to improve neurological function with the person who's afflicted, but with those people around them having a hopeful way of connecting. Connie, I want to also let you talk a little bit about how people can find out more about your work at the Institute for Music and Neurological
Sure.
Functioning.
Thank you, because we do have community programs and to provide music therapy services virtually around the world, actually. I do have a new book out. It's called Music Has Power, Best Practices from Music Therapy in Senior Health and Wellness. The Institute can be found, it's just imnf.org, and that's the best way to find out about our programs. We have a Facebook page also where we post information about conferences, symposiums. We have a big symposium happening on November 20th in New York City. And if people want to reach me through email, they could do it at imnf.wartburg, wartburg.org. That's where the Institute is located in New York.
Thank you so much, Connie.
Thank you, Peter.
Really appreciate your being here and sharing your work with us.
My pleasure. And nice to meet you, Steve. Thank you.
You too. This has been fascinating, really, and it kind of connects the dots for how this all works. We might have an idea of how the brain works with music, but it was very clear today. Peter, Baltic Street into Action, the website for that?
BalticStreetIntoAction.org. .com. You can find out about our projects and our associations with other organizations.
Wonderful work both of you are doing and have done. And for that, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.